Hello everyone. On behalf of the Hood Museum of Art, I would like to welcome you to tonight's MANTON Foundation Annual OROZCO Lecture. Please note that a brief Q&A will take place near the end of the program. My name is Olvin Abrego Ayala, and my pronouns are he, him. I'm a final year student majoring in Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies. I am also the co-president and co-founder of the Central Americans United Student Association, which is Dartmouth's first Central American club. In my time here, I have loved to see an increase in Central American visibility, and Kency Cornejo's talk today is a testament of that. At this time, I would like to ask everyone to turn off their cell phones or set them on silent mode. Please note the emergency exit is to the left and those in the back of the auditorium where you entered. It is now my pleasure to invite John Stomberg, the Virginia Rice Kelsey 1961 S Director, to the podium.
Thank you for that. I am John, director here. As we like to do, we want to acknowledge where we are and why. I've stopped reading our land acknowledgement as it is printed on our door so that it doesn't become rote, but remains kind of top of mind and fresh, that we recommit to our relationships with the people who have inhabited these lands from time immemorial and still today, and that we at the Hood and hopefully at Dartmouth are committed to having mutual trusting relationships with the people who have always called this place home. And we try and do that with our programming and by reminding ourselves and all of our audiences that this is important work and that it's never ending and that we continue daily to bring that to the front of our minds. So with that, I am pleased to present this year's installment in our series of annual lectures that revolve around the epic of American civilization, the internationally celebrated mural by Jose Clemente Orozco, located on the ground floor of Baker Library. These lectures have been made possible by an endowment funded by the MANTON Foundation, which promotes scholarship on and provides care and conservation for the Orozco murals at Dartmouth. We'd like to express our gratitude to the MANTON Foundation for their ongoing support for the care of these amazing murals and ensuring that they continue to be a touchstone for scholarship on campus. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to our host this evening, Jorge Cuellar, who is both an assistant professor of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies and the faculty director of Casa Cuba Exchange Program. Professor Cuellar is a scholar of politics, of culture, and daily life in modern Central America. His research and teaching focus on Central American studies, cultural studies, race, migration, and critical social theory. I'm mistaken. His current book, Everyday Life and Everyday Death in El Salvador, traces the practices of peoplehood, community formation, and everyday life-making amongst varied groups in El Salvador since the end of the Salvadoran Civil War. So please welcome Professor Cuellar, who will introduce this evening's speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon for what promises to be a powerful lecture on Central American visual culture. I am beyond excited for this lecture and to introduce my friend, my colleague, and my comrade, Dr. Kency Cornejo, to you all. Dr. Kency Cornejo is currently Associate Professor of Latinx and Latin American Art and Expressive Culture in the Department of Chicana and Central American Studies at UCLA, a position that she began this year. Before joining UCLA, Dr. Cornejo was a faculty member in the Art History Department at the University of New Mexico. Her research and teaching specializations include art and visual culture of Central America and its diasporas, creative interventions in the context of anti-colonial and anti-racist social movements, and decolonial aesthetics and methodologies in art. She's the author of this book, Visual Disobedience, Art and Decoloniality in Central America, published by Duke University Press in October 2024. And this book is a first of its kind tome that features 40 artists and over 80 artworks from the post-war region. She's quite literally put Central America on the map. Some of her publications on U.S. Central American art can also be found in the Journal of Latin American, Latino, and Latino Visual Culture, the Journal of Commonwealth and Postcolonial Studies, Aslan, a Journal of Chicano Studies, Art and Documentation, and in a variety of edited volumes and catalogs. She is currently the editorial board member for Latin American and Latinx Visual Culture, for Interventions, an online publication of the Latinx Project at New York University, and for X as Intersection, Writing on Latinx Art, an online publication by the U.S. Latinx Art Forum. Dr. Cornejo received a PhD in Art History and Visual Studies from Duke University, holds an MA in Art History from UT Austin, and a BA in Art History from UCLA. Her work has been supported by the Fulbright Foundation, the Ford Foundation, an Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant, and a National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Award Grant, among many others. Kency Cornejo was born to Salvadoran immigrants and raised in Compton, California. Again, thank you, Kency, for making the journey to Hanover on this frigid day. It's been a treat to have you in my classes and to hang out this afternoon, shuttling you back and forth in between the snow. That being said, please join me in welcoming this year's speaker for the MANTON Foundation Annual OROZCO Lecture, Dr. Kency Cornejo, to Dr. College.
So, thank you so much. I laugh about you shuttling me everywhere because people know I have a torn ligament, so it's been a mission walking around, but the hospitality here has been amazing. You've made this a very easy and enjoyable trip. The conversations you've started already with your students have been amazing. So I'm excited to just expand on those here, and I am really, really happy. So good afternoon, everyone. I want to also extend my gratitude to Jorge Coyat, Mia Gal, and Sharon Reed for the invitation and the coordination of this program, just the emails going back and forth, a lot of labor, so thank you. And thank you to the audience for your attendance, especially in the middle of this snowy weather. The focus of my lecture tonight will be on my recently published book, Visual Disobedience, Art and Decoloniality in Central America. First, I will share with you the origins of the book, how it came to be and why, because I think that's important to the politics of it, followed by an overview of the book and discussion of selected artworks, and then we will have time probably for a few questions. So that was supposed to be the title slide. So this is a book based on about 20 years of research and inquiry through my entire academic studies and career. However, this is not a book that originated at a university. Beyond the subject of study, this book is deeply personal and political to me in many ways. In fact, I would say that its inception extends back to the 1980s with this image. This is me around 6 years old in the Pico Union area of Los Angeles. This was our home after my parents had fled the rising repression and political violence in El Salvador that led to a 12-year-long civil war made possible through economic and military support of the United States government. As you see here on this map, it is the smallest country of the region, yet 75,000 Salvadorians were killed during the span of the war, with over 8,000 disappeared and 1 million displaced. My maternal grandmother stands behind me in this photograph, and we both gaze at her youngest son, my uncle, who is cutting his birthday cake as we celebrate his 14th birthday. He was one of 3 teenage uncles in our home who my parents helped flee El Salvador at a time when the military raided schools and kidnapped boys 12 years of age or older, forcing them to serve in the army, training them to torture and kill their own. Maybe if he had lived, my grandfather, his father, would also be in this picture. But around this time, he was murdered by the Salvadorian death squads. I remember well when my mother received the phone call that her father was killed with a grenade. The experience of growing up in a household of refugees and amidst stories of persecution, torture, and assassination of friends and family back home made me suspect of military armies, the state, and the police at a young age. I didn't have the language then, but I understood clearly we were unwanted and viewed as disposable for being poor, for being campesinos, for asking questions, and for daring to claim our humanity. This view, however, was only amplified by growing up in an inner city, in my beloved Compton, California, where nonetheless institutional racism, corrupt police, and inadequate resources made criminalization of Black and brown youth part of my reality. So this idea of war to me was not one that existed in another geographical location, in another so-called third world area far away. Rather, I grew up with an understanding that the technologies of war against the poor, against immigrants, against racialized peoples were materialized everywhere and across borders. Yet it was also in that house of refugees where I became a creative, where my teenage uncles, refugees, and self-taught artists taught me to draw and paint before I even learned English, before I could even read or write. In that house, art was inseparable from our quotidian lives. So this coexistence of death and violence on the one hand, and art and creation on the other, strongly shaped my view of the world. But specifically, it made clear that art was not something we bought or collected, or only found in museums, but that rather it was personal, it was political, it was testimony, it was memory, and indeed it was a matter of life or death. I later learned that telling our stories is an insubordination to a colonial system that thrives on the erasure of our humanity. I would notice this in the dominant media, where US historical amnesia repeatedly omitted its role in the creation of war in Central America. Through this historical amnesia, empire distorted its role in human rights violations and instead framed current Central American asylum seekers as nobodies, with no histories or networks, and as criminals to be deported or to be imprisoned, even if they were children, or even if they were babies. Life taught me, not the university, that to create art in the face of death and destruction is a radical act of defiance. And that is the premise at the core of my book. What I've prefaced so far is not in the book explicitly, it's a personal anecdote that I'm sharing with you tonight, but it is the impetus that led to the questions driving my research. When I decided as an undergraduate student to study Central American art, I was questioned if the region even had art, as if no creation could come from a people reduced to a region of bananas, volcanoes, and revolutions, or seen solely as victims. Even though Central Americans were popularly studied in the social sciences through the lens of political theories and economies, as sociological case studies of Latin American uprisings, the attention to its art and culture were minimal. However, the connection between art-making testimony, history, family, and community were never divorced for me. They were always interconnected. I always knew we made art. So embedded deeper in my initial art historical questions were my real inquiries. Why are some people's culture made invisible? Why are some erased? Why does this feel like violence? Why is empire so invested in erasing traces of our humanity? And what happens when we defy it, when we create, and when we tell our own stories? My book, Visual Disobedience, highlights 40 Central American artists and over 80 artworks in a post-war context, from the 1990s to the present. In it, I show how the aftermath of decades of US intervention in Central America, despite peace accords in the 1990s, manifested into new forms of violence for the region, especially through gender and racial violence and the criminalization of the poor. With the framework of visual disobedience, I theorize Central American art as a specific defiance to both nation states and the ways colonialism functions in art and visuality, what I call visual coloniality. The thematic chapters, which focus on Maya indigenous resistance, femicide and erotic autonomy, migration and transnationalism, and criminalization and the carceral state, reveal the new manifestations of violence in the region that fuels the current migratory crisis and rise of detention centers in the US, while also underscoring the role of art in Central American resistance and self-determination. I reveal two political and conceptual shifts in this post-war context. One is a departure from the left-right-wing dichotomies of decades prior, with a move to understanding systems of oppression as embedded with colonialism and coloniality in its institutions, including the nation state. and the other is a shift from traditional and public art, painting, drawings, murals, posters, that was popular in the war years, to experimental practices in art such as video installations, interventions, and conceptual art where the focus is on the idea, and performance art where the medium is the body. For instance, in one of the most iconic performances of the region, titled El Círculo, Guatemalan artist Jorge de Leon inserts a needle and thread through his lips in a circular motion, sealing his lips shut as a testimony to the continuity and cyclical nature of violence in the so-called post-war region. Metaphorically, he enacted the repeated sequence of silencing and violence that, despite the signing of the peace accords 4 years earlier in Guatemala that ended a 36-year-long war, remained a common form of repression through fear tactics and unresolved injustices. De Leon was not only physically drawing and visualizing with the needle and thread, but also feeling this painful act. His performance conveys the continuous muzzling of history pain, a historical pain and scarring of the collective body, and the rotation of state and imperial aggression that artists in my book address. As I note in my first chapter on Maya Indigenous art, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reported that up to 80% of the deaths during the conflict in Guatemala, which was from 1960 to 96, were of Maya Indigenous peoples, many of whom were terrorized, tortured, and disappeared. Maya Indigenous children were explicitly military targets for destruction during war, which the military labeled bad seeds to justify their elimination. For the state, Maya children constituted internal enemies by default of their birth, since their indigeneity was automatically construed by the state as communist and subversive. The Maya Tsukuhi, Maya Cachiquel, and Maya Quechí artists in my first chapter all belong to that generation of bad seeds. Their existence is not only a defiance to the nation state, but to centuries of colonialism, because despite aims to eliminate them, these seeds grew up anyways, and they became artists. Many of them now use their bodies in public spaces to expose hidden sounds, language, and memories of the disappeared during the armed conflict and turn them into decolonial gestures of healing. In Letania, conceptualized by artist Angel Bollon, the artist invited a member of his Maya Cachiquel community in the town of Comalapa, Carlos Bollon, to assist in carrying out this action. With a machete, Carlos dug a hole in the ground, creating a portal or a window into the depths of the earth. Then, with a lighted candle, a jar of water, and a list with hundreds of the names of those disappeared during the conflict in Comalapa, Carlos spoke into the pit, communicating with the souls of the disappeared. One by one, he read out their names and posed a series of questions. What happened to you? What did they do to you? Where are you now? For the performance, Bollon referred to a Mayan Cachiquel ritual of calling the names of the deceased, whose souls were suspected to still wander in the realm of the living, and encouraged them to transcend into another cosmological dimension. Carlos, whose father was among the disappeared, was an active member of the mobilization to search for the disappeared and to exhume their cadavers when they were located in clandestine graves. Originally, Angel imagined Carlos to carry out the ritual for his father, and thus offering Carlos the opportunity for a desahogo, or a vent or relief of pain. Yet as he explained, Carlos felt he could not ignore the other victims and chose instead to summon a dialogue with all the disappeared in Comalapa, offering a collective remembrance and healing. Like Bollon, the Maya Indigenous artists I analyzed addressed an array of experiences, from rural violence, forced assimilation, migration, to the importance of language and ancestral memories as a defiance to colonial erasure. Maya Cachiquel artist Marilyn Elanin Borror, born in San Juan, Zacatepeques, is especially concerned with cultural loss in the linguistic realm. Her interest in language stems from her parents' choice to not teach their daughter Cachiquel in order to shield her from the racism she would endure by speaking the language. As a result, Borror felt disconnected from certain aspects of her Maya identity and was constrained in her relationship with her grandmother, who refused to speak to her granddaughter in Spanish. Borror found this was a common experience of many of her generation, those born during the Civil War and whose parents experienced the height of anti-Indigenous violence. Because language is connected to Maya cosmovision, a whole generation of Maya people are losing the stories and histories passed on by the elders. To resist this loss of language and identity, Borror began studying Cachiquel and read dictionaries. One day, she encountered a section in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, in which the citizens of Macondo began forgetting everything, including the names of objects, and they start to label everyday items to retain their names and avoid falling into an oblivion of dismembering. Relating Macondo to Guatemala, Aurora began a series of urban interventions titled Para no olvidar sus nombres, first in San Jose, Costa Rica in 2012, and then in Guatemala City in 2013. Aurora centers Central American cities where indigenous populations are especially invisibilized through assimilation practices fueled by the type of anti-indigenous discrimination her parents tried to protect her from. In her interventions, she labels urban objects with both the dominant indigenous language in that city and its colonial translation in Spanish. Objects labeled range from steps to light posts, benches, public bones, streets, and so on, as you see here. For instance, in this 2013 intervention in Costa Rica, she labeled each of the steps on the stairway, both in the indigenous language Cadecar and its Spanish translation, with subir and bajar, corresponding to the direction of the person walking over them. The language belongs to the Cadecar people, an indigenous people of eastern Costa Rica. This poetic labeling points to the action and use of the steps rather than its name. The label also relinks the visual and oral dimensions of the Mayan language, as the artist realized that some Maya youth could recite Mayan words, but could not visibly recognize or read them. The eventual vanishing effect of the deteriorating labels as they are walked on over time further signals the threat of disappearance of Mayan languages in cosmovisions. With her interventions, Aurora resists the loss of indigenous language to coerce assimilation by reinserting them in spaces where they are mostly negated or repressed, like the urban cities. She forces indigenous Latinos, a term she uses to describe Maya people who are assimilated into Latino culture, to retain the language and reminds the non-indigenous that the urban space they occupy is still indigenous land. The experimentation with medium, especially the emergence of performance art in post-war Central America, facilitated a critical approach to gender, sexuality, and desire beyond the right-left-wing rhetoric of decades prior. Previously, in the 1970s and 80s, a regional feminist visual culture centered the heroic, autonomous, revolutionary woman and was aimed for the masses. Posters and murals range from scenes of insurrection to health and social campaigns, many relying on women to uphold and materialize socialist objectives for a liberated society, as you see here. Yet in the post-war context, artists began using their body as the medium, which gave way to embodied acts that analyzed their corporal experiences in critical ways. Artists began to expose the coloniality of gender and unravel how heteropatriarchal culture and misogyny are embedded in the multiple structures of violence and policing that target women and non-heteronormative and non-gender conforming people in Central America. These themes, as I highlight in my book, range from femicide, interpersonal violence, neoliberalism, rape of body and lands, anti-indigenous and anti-black racism, Western canons of beauty and body image, as well as homophobia and transphobia. Exposing these intersectional oppressive systems illuminates the context of displacement and migration for thousands of women and non-binary or non-heteronormative people that are actually seeking asylum today. For instance, as with NAFTA in Mexico, CAFTA, the Central American Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, proved detrimental to the economic and social state of the region. Especially a proliferation of maquiladoras as a result of the neoliberal model generated conditions for increased exploitation, violence, and violation of rights of women workers. Thus, these labor sites have become a less visible but equally dangerous site of gendered violence in post-war Central America. Salvadorian artist Dalia Chavez condemns the neoliberal model in El Salvador that led to an increase in sweatshops and gender violence and a diminishment in the artisanal work of many Salvadorians. Ilo Vasco, for instance, is a municipality in the Cabañas department of El Salvador that is well known for generations of artisans who produce a range of clay-based ceramics purchased by locals and international tourists alike. Especially popular are the clay miniatures, no bigger than 2 inches, that depict Salvadorians in quotidian activities. Yet like other artisan towns with a history of artesanía production, Ilo Vasco faces the threat of economic displacement and cultural loss from the rise of industrialized mass production in the country. To bring attention to the displacement of monetary and cultural capital and how it affects women, Chavez created Falsa Franco, for which she hired artisans from Ilo Vasco to produce a large quantity of miniatures that she then painted by hand. The miniatures are commissioned to all recreate women sweatshop workers. She installed the miniatures over a brick and mortar base, subverting the traditional polished exhibition display stands and making further visual reference to cheap manual labor. The miniatures, arranged in a series of rows, convey the inside of a textile sweatshop. All the women stand in front of sewing machines. In the center, an isolated figure represents the overseer, a man who monitors and controls the women's bodies and their production. By hand-painting different features, hair color, and dress of the many of the identical miniatures, the artist rejects the loss of individuality that comes with mass production. With a demand for workers and their disposability and easy replacement, disregard the personal narrative, struggles, and lives of each of the female workers. She also directly points to the panoptic system of surveillance for women workers and maquiladoras, where the only male figure, the overseer, is the sole power exerting control over a mass number of women, under whose monitoring eye abuses against women persist. Chavez placed a surveillance camera over the installation so that the entire piece would be recorded and displayed on a monitor on the other side of an adjacent wall, capturing not only the installation miniatures, but also the audience viewers who approach the gaze and gaze over the work. The viewers thus also become a reference not only as witness, but as consumers of such labor products and as complicit. Another artist in this chapter reveals feminist concerns extend to erotic autonomy and repression of LGBTQ communities in the region. With a long history of activism, including as co-founder of the activist organization Operación Queer, the Nicaraguan artist known as Elila, which is a play on El Ila, is familiar with the erasure of queer bodies within political organizations and uses performative interventions as a way to undo the patriarchal idea of the nation. In 2018, Nicaragua experienced the deadliest manifestation since the end of the Civil War, when the Sandinistas, led by Daniel Ortega, triumphed over the Somoza dictatorship. Since 2007, Ortega has remained president of Nicaragua, and in 2016, he consolidated his power by making the First Lady, Rosario Murillo, his vice president. What began as discontent in response to Ortega's proposed social security forms in 2018 escalated to broader protests against the Ortega government, its hold of power, and its plans to rebuild an interoceanic canal that would displace Afro-Indigenous communities. As demonstrations increased in size and number, the Ortega government responded by cracking down on protesters with beatings and incarceration, resulting in 325 deaths and more than 500 detained. LGBTQ people were especially targeted. During the manifestations, First Lady and Vice President Murillo taunted protesters by comparing them to tiny little ants eager to accuse her of any crime. It was a reference to a poem she previously wrote titled Tengo miedo de tanta realidad, which expressed her fear of rodents, cockroaches, and in particular ants, which she described as tiny beings with small thoughts, small agendas, and small consciousness. When she publicly compared them to ants, protesters countered her analogy by adopting the ant as a symbol of resistance and collective dissidence. In response, Elila initiated a two-part performance titled Yo no tengo miedo de tanta realidad, or I am not so afraid of so much reality. First in San Francisco, California, where the artist resided after leaving Nicaragua due to death threats. The second part was performed the following year in Mexico City. In the first performance, Elila wore a black corset, high heels, and other items that exposed the body fully covered in red. In the second, a similar outfit and wig in blue revealed their body covered in white. In personifying each pair of colors, black-red adopted by the Sandinistas and blue-white adopted by the Ortega government, the artist critiques both political spectrums for the continuous erasure of queer existence. In both performances, the artist walked in procession to the Nicaraguan embassies, where they released 300 ants at the embassy doorsteps. Simultaneously, the artist recited the names of the students, activists, and campesinos killed during the protests. As such, Elila countered Murillo's metaphoric words with 300 physical and real ants, which metonymically represent the nearly 300 protesters killed by that time. Chavez and Elila are only two of many more artists in this chapter who expose intersectional oppressive systems and thus illuminate the context of displacement and migration for thousands of women and non-binary or non-heteronormative people seeking asylum. I think it's important to also mention that one of the first caravans from Central American migrants were LGBTQ caravan, actually. One of the tasks of my book is to decenter the traditional focus of the US-Mexico border as the site of migration discourse and show how the conceptual shift of the border actually extends down to Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and even along the vertical border that is Mexico. For instance, in an intervention titled Rostros Vivos, Costa Rican artist Guillermo Vargas, known as Habakkuk, exposes Nicaragua's anti-immigrant stance and its anti-Black racism, clearly evidenced in Peñas Blancas, the border post between Nicaragua and Costa Rica. With the help of photographer Julia Murillo, the artist photographed 12 Haitian and African refugees in Peñas Blancas, creating large-scale black and white portraits. And with the artist's cause of photographic intervention in public spaces, 300 posters were plastered on walls, poles, and trees all over Managua the night before the 2016 presidential election. The faces belong to a group of refugees from Haiti, the Republic of Congo, Togo, Ghana, and Senegal. They represent a wave of migrants fleeing unbearable economic conditions or political persecution and seeking refuge and work opportunities in the United States, often arriving in Brazil, Colombia, or Ecuador with the plan of passing through the isthmus on their way to the US. Since 2015, the Nicaraguan government has officially closed its borders to these migrants and refugees, deeming them as threats to national security. Each portrait, Habakkuk placed the iconic Sandino hat. With this symbol, the artist challenged and exposes the hypocrisy of the Ortega's government, who, as mentioned, in the last few years executed repression against its people, thus failing to uphold the Sandino legacy. The next morning, as Nicaraguans headed to the ballots to determine Daniel Ortega's re-election, they were confronted with the faces of the hundreds to thousands of human beings its government excluded, criminalized, and invisibilized. With Rostro Vivos, the artist exposes an anti-immigrant and anti-Black system of border violence and failed utopias and promises where even a revolutionary nation failed to address the intersection of race and citizenship and its ideals of liberation. While we often center the US-Mexico border as a site of violence for Central American migrants, artists like Habakkuk expose how Central American nation-states practice the same colonial logics of border imperialism within the isthmus. You might remember when that photograph circulating at the border with Haitian migrants and Border Patrol. This work was done so many years before that. For those Central Americans who head north before arriving at the US-Mexico border, they must first survive Mexico. Mexico implemented multiple migration stations along the southern border to control migration, ensuring that detection, detainment, and deportation could take place at any point in Mexico's terrain, not just at the Mexico-Guatemala border. Starting in 2007, increasing numbers of migrant detentions were no longer concentrated at the southern border region, but equally increased in the central and northern regions of Mexico. This vertical expansion of migration control from the southern Mexico-Guatemala border to the northern US-Mexico border reinforced the notion of Mexico as a vertical border. In her performance and sculptural piece Mobile, Guatemalan artist Regina Galindo focused on the unequal power relations Central Americans experience as they passed through Mexico. Now Mexico is the most dangerous country for Central American migrants, with mass deportations, more than 20,000 migrant abductions per year, an estimated 24,000 bodies buried in unmarked graves, and 40,000 unidentified bodies found in public morgues. Exhibited in Mexico City, the artist laid inside a closed metal coffin on a stretcher trolley as spectators were allowed to move the coffin around the gallery space as they wished. What began as slight movements became aggressive and jagged manipulations in space. Audience members forcefully thrust the coffin into the crowd or empty space, dragged it in circular motions, and slammed it into a chair and wall with complete disregard for the body inside. The uneven power between the spectators' control of the coffin and the artist's vulnerability echoes the volatility Central American migrants endure when crossing the vertical border, where their bodies are subjected to abuse. By shifting the border, we're also reminded that family separation takes place even before arriving at the US-Mexico border, when migrants are forced to leave their families behind to survive the neoliberal and colonial policies that make a dignified life in their home countries impossible. Anti-immigrant critics often vilify migrants for either leaving their families or taking their journey with their children, accusing them of being irresponsible and unfit parents. Yet the systemic violence in the region gives them no choice. Salvadorian artist Catalina del Cid uses drawing and installation to show how monetary allowances have become symbolic of transnational parenting, or what is described as parenting from afar through remittances. In her installation, Electrodomésticos más regalos es amor, one sees a low-cost entertainment center typically found in Salvadorian homes where family members send remittances. Like a memorial, the piece of furniture holds valuable gifts migrant parents send to their children, such as a television, a small stereo sound system, or toys from popular movies like the Buzz Lightyear doll depicted to the top right of the television, or the E.T. doll to the left, or fashion items like the Adidas shoes on the lower left side of the stereo. The toys or shoes, seemingly meant for children, are here depicted as sacred items for display, perhaps used only on special occasions, resulting in a piece of furniture that resembles a shrine full of relics. The framed photograph of the mother and two daughters opposite a framed Sacred Heart Christ further evokes the fusion of holy reverence for the family and gratitude, but also serves as a site of prayer, indicating the fears, worries, and emotional precarity that separated families endure. The scene points to the emotional value ascribed to electronic items and gifts because from a distance they are often the only way migrant parents can convey their love. The items signify a better life of comfort for their children when parents are unable to be near them. It further indicates how migrant parents often confess their guilt and sorrow for their absence from their children, and it simultaneously alludes to the children who sometimes express resentment and rebellious behavior for what they see as their parents' abandonment. The installation, more than representing a modest piece of furniture in a typical home, serves as evidence of the emotional traumas between separated families and their struggles to maintain loving connections despite the distance brought on by forced migration. Yet these gifts also represent a financial struggle parents spare their children from knowing. By shifting the border, these artworks, along with others, instead highlight the many intricacies of Central American migration. Relatedly, in the final chapter, I reveal how criminality is not ascribed on Central American migrants only upon reaching the U.S.-Mexico border. From the U.S. making of transnational gangs to the increase of mass incarceration in the region and a wave of mysterious prison fires that are burning inmates alive, I show how Central American artists theorize illegality and delinquency within a broader colonial agenda of dehumanization. Beyond a critique of anti-immigrant sentiment, they reveal and expose a carceral logic rooted in coloniality that perpetuates the criminalization of Central Americans across borders, and that is inseparable from the colonial agenda of social cleansing of poor, racialized, and the marginalized in the region. Salvadorian artist Dani Zabaleta, for instance, highlights how CAFTA outlaws those who work in unregulated informal economies, that is street vendors, bootleggers, and merchants of counterfeit clothes or pirated music and movies. For his Se Busca series, Zabaleta created vintage Western-style wanted posters. Each featured the portrait of a known vendor with a pirate patch over his eye in reference to their common label, pirata. Above the portrait, the artist included the words Se Busca, Los Piratas del Centro, or wanted, downtown pirates. And below the portrait are physical descriptions of each, including skin color, piel morena, or dark skin, their location, and the crime they are wanted for, such as vendors of CDs or vendors of toys. Zabaleta also spent time interviewing downtown vendors and learning of their work and challenges following the Salvadorian government's campaign to remove all illegal vendors from city's downtown area without offering alternative economic opportunities, which would leave 36,000 families unemployed. This campaign stems from a CAFTA policy that requires participating nations to protect U.S. intellectual property rights, which means policing and criminalizing vendors whose livelihood depend on this informal economy of piracy. Such policies criminalize vendors, subjecting them to fines and imprisonment. Challenging the policing of vendors whose work in fear of authorities and are constantly on the move and in hiding, the artist recreates the vendors' portraits from the Se Busca series onto the walls of the country's modern art museum, installing them as large-scale murals. Zabaleta collides an art space that celebrates creativity with the illegality of creative subsistence, forcing museum-goers to face the country's most vulnerable working sector, which is nonetheless a dynamic pillar of the Salvadorian economy. The artist also intervened in the city of San Jose, Costa Rica, plastering the wanted posters all over the city, often amid already existing graffiti, and thus blending them into aesthetics of unlawful practices. As people walked by and inquired about the wanted person, Zabaleta explained the context and critique behind his works, allowing him to engage with citizens on the injustice of such criminalizing practices, thus countering the dominant carceral logic that hinges on the criminalization of poor and racialized Salvadorians. Amid a longer history of incarceration, artists note that the post-war period has seen a more extreme rise of prisons and detainment. Artists reveal not only the increasing rates of mass incarceration, but also the human rights violations and social cleansing enacted through carceral logics, especially seen in the fires that burn inmates alive. One recent example was seen in Guatemala on March 8, 2017, when a fire broke out at the Virgen de la Asunción's girls' shelters. Girls were detained there for various reasons that did not implicate criminal activity, yet popular consensus was that these were rebellious troublemakers or gang members. Some of the girls were orphans who became wards of the state. Others were runaways who escaped bullying, familial, physical, and sexual abuse, and/or gang violence in their neighborhoods. Others were surrendered by their families to the state because they could not financially afford medical or specialized care. The shelter already had a long history of abuse. It was designed to hold a maximum of 350 youth, but held around 700 children. A year before the fire, a court ordered the shelter to be shut down after an investigation documented 45 complaints of children's rights violations and a possible sex trafficking network inside the shelter. However, it remained open, and 41 girls died in that fire that day. Outraged over the fire led many Guatemalans to protest the abuse and negligence, specifically the way the girls died, since their death could have been prevented. They were all in a room when the fire started, and they screamed and pleaded for 9 minutes to be let out, but the guards refused. 25 minutes later, the firefighters arrived and their scorched bodies were removed, while others died shortly after from smoke inhalation, and 15 survived with severe injuries. In memory of the girls, the artist Regina Galindo created a sound performance. Las escucharon gritar y no abrieron las puertas, or they heard them cry and they did not open the doors. 51 women, including some of the mothers of the victims who volunteered to participate, joined Galindo in the performance. As both an act of catharsis and a protest, the women enclosed themselves in a room where they shouted for 9 minutes, the amount of time the girls pleaded for help and were ignored. Microphones document their yells and cries resulting in the audio piece, while photographs visually documented the women, whose distress and exhaustion becomes evident in their faces. The performance produces a memory archive that, when heard, counters the silence brought on by the guards' refusal and denial of the girls' supplications. Others, like Panamanian artist Hafiz Quintero, who himself was incarcerated for a decade, defies the prison system by creating informative and pedagogical tools for death and survival in prison confinement. In his performance, Máximas de Seguridad, the artist smuggles survival manuals into the prison. In an illustrated pocket-sized handbook, Quintero presents various scenarios of danger and offers instructional, practical solutions for the incarcerated reader. The manual coaches that if poisoned by another inmate or guard, one should drink milk, and a simple didactic illustration accompanies the instruction. The manual further demonstrates where on the body one can conceal weapons, such as between the buttocks. What the key body points are to cause severe injury to another, where one can hide personal possessions inside a prison, and how to maintain emotional connections with the outside world. By offering instructions on survival, the manual defies carceral violence and the logic of captivity. For the performance component of the work, the artist distributed the manuals at a Costa Rican prison during visiting hours, when people wait hours in line to visit their loved ones. He approached those waiting, offered them a manual, and asked them to smuggle it inside for their loved ones and other inmates. Quintero and others in this final chapter reveal a position against policing, criminalization, and imprisonment of Central Americans, both within the region and across borders. And as I show, instead push not for immigration reform, not for selective citizenship, but for an abolition of the carceral logic, the carceral state, and the carceral state's mechanism of violence. I'll conclude by returning to this picture. A year or two after this picture was taken, as then President Reagan continued to deny asylum to Central American migrants, and as he used an anti-communist campaign to funnel even more money illegally into Central America, several of my family members feared deportation, so they left the US and migrated to Canada. So there's a large Salvadorian diaspora in Canada as well, and where many remain. My uncle here was one of them. Unable to secure a stable life in the US from Canada, he migrated back and forth until 2016. And that year, on New Year's Eve, as I was still finishing this book, we received a call that my uncle mysteriously died in a Salvadorian prison, where he was deported to from Canada, while applying for citizenship. He was never charged, and no details were given to his family, who were denied access to him during his incarceration. Only seeing him again and for the last time when his body was released for burial. That moment and many others like it were constant reminders as I wrote this book that visual narratives matter, and it matters who creates them, who receives them, and how they disrupt colonial logics to subtly or loudly demand a just world. Collectively, the artistic interventions, embodiments, images, and practices in this book respond to the question, what happens when we create our own visual narratives, when we tell our own art histories as we have lived them, and when we use our own modes of knowledge and communication? I show in this book that the answer can only be defiance. Creation and existence in the face of death and colonial violence will always be an act of insubordination to the nation state, to hegemonic narratives, to the violence of erasure, to empire, and even to the art world and its institutions. This book has centered on those narratives that emerged through visual disobedience, narratives from Central American creative perspectives that reveal both a complex social-political context ignored in the dominant media and histories and a creative ability and agency historically denied to us. And for me, writing this book was my own act of disobedience. Thank you. Maybe we have a few minutes.
Hi, thank you so much for that really passionate talk that I learned so much listening to. And thank you for sharing so much of your personal traumas and experience in this book. And I think it's such an important, it's so important that as art historians we find ways to do that, I think. And I think you've done it so beautifully. So my question is about kind of the art world, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how these artists, because I noticed it's a lot of installation, it's a lot of like kind of actions that take place outside of museums and outside of galleries, the majority of them that you showed us. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the kind of uptake in the art world and the kind of institutional parameters around this kind of work that you are gathering and presenting in this important book.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, the whole art world in Central America, where to start? I guess I'll point out that what I focus on in the book is this shift, right? From art made during the 70s and 80s, during the conflicts, during the war period, which because of the nature of war, happens to be public art, murals, posters, which has been studied, the work of David Craven and David Kunzel, focused especially on the murals of Nicaragua, right? What I wanted to show was what happened after the wars ended, after peace accords were signed in El Salvador in 1992 and in Guatemala in 1996, when supposedly, okay, the war is over, right? There's probably no need to migrate, there's no need, violence is done. But what I wanted to show was how actually in that period, violence manifested into different forms. The aftermath of violence led to new ways and structures of aggression that affected people that were then fueling the sort of mass migration that we see today, right? And one of the things that also happens in the art world at the time in Central America, the Central American art world, is that without the war, artists start connecting with each other. So I was mentioning to some of the students earlier that, for instance, there's a Central American biennial, and artists started exhibiting with each other and having conversations. Or one of the first symposiums on Central American art took place in Costa Rica, led by Virginia Perez Laton, who brought artists and cultural workers from each country to meet for the first time, and then they started reporting to each other on the artistic context of each nation. Then they realized all the things they had in common and all of the differences, right? Performance art was very big in Guatemala, maybe less so in some of the other countries, right? Costa Rica has a strong cultural infrastructure, more so than some of the other countries as well. So when this dialogue starts happening, artists who start creating work in their own nations really start looking regionally at the isthmus and also the diaspora, the US-based diaspora, because by then there's many Central Americans in the US, right? So that entire context also led to an experimentation with art, which is why you see the rise of performance as something that comes after the war period, right? One of the examples, the perfect examples is Regina Galindo, who's one of the main performance artists of the region. You know, just because the war ends doesn't mean that, you know, injustices are solved, that there isn't trauma, that there are things that people are trying to work with. And one of the things that she felt she needed to do was go into the public space, right? Take back these spaces that were actually controlled by the state as sites of repression and torture and disappearance and just violence, and take back these public spaces and with their own bodies to work through some of the issues, some of the traumas, some of the violence, to make sense of things, to understand it, and to even protest, right? So I specifically focus on these new art practices. So you see a lot of installation, a lot of video, a lot of performance art, although a whole book could be made just on painting, just on drawing, right? But I also wanted to show this because I felt that Central America was kind of seen as just the murals in Nicaragua or just the posters, which aren't always made by Central Americans, right? Some of them were made in solidarity. But I wanted to show how Central American artists were theorizing, historicizing, and at the same time experimenting with meanings in art practices, right? So that's why you see a focus on that in the works and the book. And you know, I have 80 artworks and 40 artists in this book. There could have been so many more, right? It was so hard to choose who would not make it, and there will have to be in other books, right? That's the plan. But this was specifically to address how the post-war, the aftermath of the war really led to these conceptual shifts, these understandings of femicide, of, you know, indigenous resistance, of criminalization and incarceration, and at the same time highlight this experimentation with art. So, I mean, that was very important. So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you. I was just wondering, well, you mentioned that there were so many other artists that you considered. Like, what was your criteria for determining what was considered like a commentary on the shift in the post-war movement?
So what was the last part of your question?
The post-war movement?
Oh, yeah. Well, just mainly that, right? Works that were addressing the sort of themes that I included in the book, but that also gave context to understand the migratory crisis. So anti-indigenous violence, the genocide, violence against migrants, LGBTQ communities, all of these types of violence are actually fueling the migration now, right? So what I wanted to give was like that context through the lens of artists, how they're specifically addressing these issues. But it was hard because even though, you know, I include these artists, they also have so many other artworks that, you know, could have been in different sections. And I just had to make executive decisions, which was not easy, and editors help and reviewers help, you know, but yeah, there's so many more that could be included. So it was basically the focus on the thematic chapters and the medium that they were using, yeah.
I don't want to take anyone. I want to make sure the students have chances to ask questions, but I wanted to also ask you to talk to the group here about the work that you're also doing on recovering Central American presence in U.S. American Chicanx and other sort of Latinx communities that have in a sense, kind of passed under the radar for a long time for a variety of reasons, and sort of just give the audience some sense of the other parts of your work.
Yeah, yeah, that's another aspect of my work. So, you know, when I started doing work on Central America, I mean, I was born in the United States, right? I'm the first person on both sides of my family, but I was looking to Central America to try to understand my existence in this place, right? And in that process, I traveled to Central America. I was working on Central American artists. And I actually have to give a lot of credit to Charlene Villaseñor-Black, who asked me to write something for an issue of Aslan on U.S. Central American artists. And I knew U.S. Central American artists. You know, I had friends, I knew other artists, but I didn't think of writing about them specifically because I was so focused like on the region, right, as something that was excluded from Latin American art. But I said yes, and I started writing and researching, and I wrote an article that I think was one of the first on U.S. Central American artists. And the issue was the question of pedagogy in Latinx art. So for me, it was like, well, you know, in the ongoing expansions of what is Latinx or Latino art, it's like, where do Central Americans fit within Latino art? Because even myself, growing up in Los Angeles, I knew about the Chicana movement, I knew about the Black Power movement, I knew all these histories of resistance. I was inspired by them. I was a mecha, you know, in high school for 40 years. But I also knew that, you know, Central America just didn't fit in that. And that part of it was the invisibility that many Central Americans feel in the US for not being part of the dominant groups. And in the Southwest, or LA, it would be, you know, not being Mexican, right? So a lot of that work started from just like that need to write about that experience and expand on how many US Central Americans are also creating art and what kind of questions and concerns come up in their artworks. And a lot of it is related to identity, to their histories of migration, to cultural aspects, even to aesthetics, right? Earlier we were looking at some art and, you know, we're like, oh, this looks like a Central American home. Like, what makes that? How do we know a Central American home in the US, right? What are the cues, the visual cues? So the entire visual culture as well is something that just started developing organically, I guess, out of just building on that first work. And now a lot of my work, some of the US Central American artists are included here, a few, but there's many, that could be a whole other book in itself, you know, which is also important. But I'm very grateful because the field has changed a lot since I started. I think it has been changing very fast. I have students, graduate students who are focusing on US Central American art, writing their dissertations. I'm on committees of students across other universities who are doing work on US Central American art as well. So I think right now Latinx art is expanding so much and growing because it needed to, and US Central American is part of that conversation. So I'm happy that those conversations are growing and expanding, and other generations, you know, as many students I've talked to here who are also building on that work, yes. So yeah, the question of Latin American art and Latinx art seem a little separated, but for me, they're actually very connected. I don't know what time it is. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kency, for your talk. I'd like to know if you can share a little bit more on the reception and how people reacted to all this artwork, because the title of your book, Visual Disobedience, so I think the reaction of people is very important in all this process, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, with so many artworks, it varies, right? Some of the most memorable ones, I think, are the performances, because if you think about it, you know, if an installation is in a museum, people go to a museum, they're looking to see art, right? They know they're gonna expect something. They don't know what it's gonna look like, but they know this is something in a safe space museum, this is, you know, considered art. But with performance and interventions, it's really interesting because it's kind of spontaneous. The audience isn't prepped. It's basically bystanders, people walking around, the public. And some of these performances are not, advertised, right? They happen spontaneously. They happen in the moment of need when an artist feels, I need to do this. Sometimes they're planned ahead and they're advertised and there's an artistic audience, but there's always people that don't know, what is this? Esta señora que está haciendo? Like, what is this person doing, And Regina's piece, Early Iconic Pieces, is one of those where she hangs in Guatemala up an archway, reading poems, throwing these poems. And people thought that she was like advertising something, publicity stunt, or a crazy woman, and she was throwing her poems. And they were like, oh, maybe it's coupons, for something. So they actually didn't even know it was written about in a newspaper. But that was early on, right? So now people are more aware of artistic interventions, even if they don't understand what's happening, even if they don't know what it's about. It's happening more often that they're like, okay, something artistic is going on, and they pay attention, right? And it sparks that curiosity. Others are like, one group that's not in here but I mentioned earlier is Artistas en Resistencia, which developed in Honduras after the coup. And everything was just interventions. In that context, people knew they were protests. There were performance and actions, readings, play, what we think of traditional performance art, but it was part of a 120 artist collective at the time of the coup. So they knew that the content was like political and it was resistance, right? So it also depends on the countries, because there are various countries in Central America, and performance art in Guatemala City is probably not so shocking as like performance art in, in Honduras or somewhere else where people may not be used to seeing a lot of that. So it really, really varies. And with so many works, especially the performance art, I think the reactions and the reception range from not knowing what it is to curiosity, to being drawn into it, and to actually being participants as audience members. And performance art creates witnesses out of people, right? It's like whether you know it or not, you become a witness to something that the artist is enacting, right, or embodying. So that's a really good question, yeah.
So I bring it to the end. So my question is really about how these artists are received in amongst sort of like the art world in Central America. It's a very sort of Europhilic art world within Central America that are still invested in sort of a certain kind of prestige and imagining the nation, right? And some of these works like really construct that, and they seem to be this art seems to be moving in sort of like collectives and informal networks. And how has like this sort of long-standing, more formal institutionalized Central American art space reacted to some of these things? Like, are these artists being exhibited in Central America through those kinds of networks, or do they still exist on the kind of margins of it?
Yeah. Great question. I think it definitely differs in each country. Like I said, Costa Rica has a stronger infrastructure, especially for experimental art. They have more spaces, galleries, museums. El Salvador has the only modern art museum in the region. Guatemala does not have a contemporary art museum, so a collective of artists created their own contemporary museum out of an old egg shop. So it's literally shaped as an egg. And it is so small that only like 4 people fit in it at a time. And they would rotate exhibitions, and it was like literally on the boulevard of something in a highly trafficked street. But that museum eventually made it to LACMA. So it was part of those exhibitions as well. So things change over time, right? There's the kind of artists that are creating interventions and creating work outside of the institutional support. And then these artists become known, and then they do start getting more support, right? Writing about these artists does something to an artist's career as well, right? And so it's really, I knew some of these artists when they were just making art, and then wrote about some of them, and then if that's the only piece on Central American art, that gets taught, and then they become visible and get seen by curators, and so it's crazy how writing about artists is so important to support their career. And, you know, and how many artists have not been written about that definitely need to be in the history books, right? That definitely need to be acknowledged and recognized. But every country has their own different politics in terms of institutions. And there's Belize, right? Belize has the Image Factory, which has been like so important for contemporary Belizean, but also Central American art. And do things, everybody has their own politics of space, right? So some of these artists have been welcomed at certain points of their careers. Before they maybe were not. Then they get the attention of a curator, or they get an exhibition, and then they receive more support from spaces back home. But a lot of them actually, because there's no official like formal training to be a curator in Central America, many artists were curating their own, you know, peers' work, right? So some of these pieces were curated by other artists. So they were supporting each other and they were creating those spaces. And collectives have been really important precisely to create a space where we can talk about art, you know, write about each other's artwork, and exhibit artwork. So all of this has changed. I had a whole chapter on the infrastructure, like art spaces, that I took out of the book that I have to place somewhere else, but it was specifically about how did artists create their own infrastructure, right? Because there is one in Central America. It's not like these artists are working out of the blue. There are people writing about art, curating art, you know, art critics. There were debates took place, and all of those, you know, they're not very visual like when you write about them, but they were very important for the discourse, right? The point is that Central Americans created Central American art world, right? So, well, thank you, everybody.